This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
So this is Bill, and I'd like to get us started on our webinar topic today, Haptics, Designing for Touch. But to sort of frame this, I want to talk a little bit about design at Stanford. Design, is a big word, and at Stanford, design is a really, really large part of what we do. We, of course, have the sort of internationally well-known D.school, which is our Graduate Institute of Design. But for over 50 years, there's been what we call the design group or the design division inside the School of Engineering. And this has been where a dedicated team of researchers, professors, and students have been looking at the really big and interesting issues in design. We have a product design discipline. We have a major called smart products that have both mechanical, electronic, sensors, motors, actuators in them. We have a lot of research in robotics. And this webinar is actually part of a series sponsored by the Innovation Masterclass on design and design thinking, our method of problem solving that puts sort of the human at the center of the problem. You can look up on the web. We have them all up on the SCPD website. Professor Chris Gerdes did a talk about autonomous vehicles and design thinking in the car of the future. Stanford, strangely enough, is one of the centers of automotive research in the U.S., sort of this kind of stuff, because cars are so computer-driven, and there's more software in most vehicles now than there are in most homes. The center of research for the car industry has sort of shifted to Silicon Valley, and Chris and his lab are building cars to drive around campus by themselves. It's very spooky. Then Professor Sherry Shepard also did a thing. We do a lot of studying at the Center for Design Research on how designers actually design. What is the thought process that designers use to design? And Sherry's been studying that. She did a webinar called Design Thinking and Peak Performance. How do you get peak performance out of innovation teams? Professor Banny Banerjee also, I think as part of a CDR thing, did a talk on design as a strategic tool, using design thinking to form strategies for companies, nonprofits, and others. But today we're going to talk, this is a brand new topic, and it's a brand new webinar. We have a new lab at Stanford. Professor Allison Okamura has joined Stanford just recently, and the CHARM lab is where Allison and her PhD students are researching haptics, which is, I'll let her explain in more detail, but haptics is designing it around the sense of touch, our sense, one of the more powerful senses of the human body is its ability to perceive the environment through the sense of touch. And even though all these topics, cars, robots, products, and other things, are very, very different subject matter, we're all united in our approach to problem solving, which we call design thinking. It's a human-centered approach where we put humans at the center of the design problem. And if you think about it, there's nothing more human than our sense of touch. We rely on it, every second of every day as part of our way of perceiving ourselves as humans in the world. Allison's done a study of this important topic, and she's going to take us through some really interesting information about haptics, particularly with regard to new forms of medical devices and surgical devices that are in the industry now, and really part of kind of the forefront of what's going on in haptics. So I'll turn it over to Allison.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Bill. I'm really delighted to be here today, and I'm glad that so many people are interested in learning about the field of haptics. So by the way, if you're interested in learning more about our research, this will be a fairly high-level talk, but the details are at the CHARM Lab website. As Stacy mentioned, CHARM stands for Collaborative Haptics and Robotics in Medicine, and our website is charm.stanford.edu if you'd like to learn more. We also have a number of outreach programs. We're really interested in getting these ideas out into the community. Today I'm going to talk about haptics designing for touch, and I want to start by having you think about the various senses that we have. There's hearing, sight, smell, taste, and touch are probably the five senses that everyone learns about in school. And in thinking about their value, one question you could ask is, of course, which sense is the most valuable to you? That might be a little bit abstract. So another way to ask the question is, in addition to saying which sense is most valuable to you, you could also say which sense is the one that you would relinquish last. And so I see people are already filling out the poll, which is terrific. I'll give you a few more seconds to let me know what you think. All right, and what's turning out is the response that I overwhelmingly get, that sight is the most important sense. And there's no wrong answer here, of course, but what I would like to do is tell you a little bit more about touch that might change some of your minds. See, there are a few people there who are interested in touch as the most valuable sense. So moving on, let's actually think a little bit, raising the question of which sense would you give up last. You could think about what would life be like without touch. And like a lot of work in science, one way to understand a particular modality of sensing or a way that humans work is to look at patients who have some kind of deficit, which has actually caused them to lose their ability to do something. And there's a gentleman from Great Britain named Ian Waterman who lost his sense of touch. And there's a great BBC documentary about him if anyone's interested in looking at more details. Now, Ian Waterman lost his sense of touch and as a consequence had trouble with a lot more than actually just perceiving the world, because obviously touch is about perception, but it's actually also a lot about movement and our ability to interact with the world and make a physical change on the world. And so Ian Waterman lost his sense of touch from his neck down and for many, many years was unable to walk, to move, to feed himself, to do many of the activities of daily living because of the loss of the sense of touch. And he actually is one of the few people in the world who have this terrible problem and who actually did manage to regain his ability to move, and he did that through compensating with the sense of sight. However, any slight distraction, he might look at a pretty girl and get distracted, he would actually fall down because he wasn't using his vision to compensate for his sense of touch. So let's think more about the sense of touch and try to emphasize why it's so important. So this is a concept from Daniel Wolpert, a well-known neuroscientist who asked the question, fundamentally, why do we have brains? So we have trees, plants that don't have brains, and we have animals, including people, who do have brains. And what is the big difference between these organisms? Well, the tree doesn't have to move around actively in kind of real time in its environment, whereas a cat does. And so the ability to move is such an essential part of what makes us active physical beings that the thought is that is the reason for having a brain, is to allow movement. And neuroscientists also look to sort of evolutionary evidence and examples from nature to inspire us in how we come up with these theories. So I've just put up a picture of the sea squirt, which is an organism that actually swims around with a rudimentary kind of brain for much of its life, and then at some point in its life it anchors itself to a rock and essentially becomes a plant, never to move again, and at that point it eats its brain, as they say. So it's sort of an amusing example of how it seems like you don't really need your brain unless you're actually moving about in the environment. So what does all this need to move and interact with the environment have to do with the sense of touch? Well, it allows us to actually, the sense of touch actually is what allows us to make these movements. So let me give you a more formal definition now of the word haptics. It really means anything having to do with the sense of touch. And it's not a made-up word. You can think of haptics is to touch as optics is to vision. And it comes from a Greek root, which means to grasp or to touch. And so the field of haptics has anything to do with touch. My specialty is on building robotic devices and virtual environments and interfaces that allow us to feel the sense of touch in kind of an artificial way. There are also many researchers who say come from the psychology or neuroscience perspective and want to understand the biology of how haptics works. And it's very complicated, as you can imagine, because there's so many different components of it. On one half, on the left of your slide, you see the cutaneous aspects. And cutaneous means having to do with the skin. So temperature, texture, slip, vibration, and local force, these are all things that you feel in your skin, which are an important part of the sense of touch. So if you just take your fingers right now and run it over the table in front of you, you can probably feel some texture, and it's information, special mechanoreceptors, which are basically little sensors embedded in your skin, which provide you with cutaneous haptic information. And on the other side of the slide, you see the kinesthesia information, which is more about large-scale forces and movements. And so another exercise you can do right now is you can hold up your hands and touch your fingers together over your head without looking at them. And you may have missed the first time you did it. You may have recovered and been able to get your fingertips together the second time. But this is being done. You can ask yourself, how is it that I'm making this movement without actually looking at it visually? And the idea is you're using your kinesthesia, which has a lot to do with the sense of haptics. It's knowing the location or configuration of your body in space, and that's very important for being able to make movements around the environment. And it requires you to know and understand through feeling, through the sense of touch, what is the motion of your limbs. And so you can feel the muscles, forces, you can feel the stretch of your skin, and all of this gives rise to knowing where your body is in space. So it's not just about feeling forces or properties of the environment, but it's also about understanding yourself. In addition, you do want to perceive things about the environment like compliance or stiffness, for example. And the combination of these large-scale forces and motion information with this cutaneous local skin information all work together with the human motor control system to do two main things, one of which is to coordinate movement and the other is to enable perception. So you can think of coordinating movement as all these things that are needed to allow you to do the activities of daily living, walk around, pick up a drink, etc., and perception to both help you perform those movements, but also just to learn about the environment. And these are all very important things for what make us human. So let me put this idea of haptics into the context of design thinking. And what this slide shows is a series of elements that go into the design thinking process. And if you've been to our webinars before, or you attend our Innovation Master Series classes, you will see this theme arise again and again. And let's start with the beginning. The first step is empathizing. And so for empathizing in almost any field, but especially in haptic design, you have to think about how am I going to provide value to the user. And so in haptics, I need to understand as a researcher and as a designer, when and where does the sense of touch actually provide that value? And I'll be talking more later about my work in the field of medical robotics, in which the user, sometimes it's the patient, say in a rehabilitation scenario, and sometimes the user is a clinician, like a surgeon. And it requires us to really understand what these patients and clinicians need. So we spend time in the operating room, we watch surgical procedures, we work with physical therapists, we talk to patients, and we try to become really embedded in the environments in which our systems are going to be used. And that empathy is a totally necessary first step for performing haptic design. The next is to actually define the problem and note what it is that needs to be solved. And empathy actually is, of course, the first step to even being able to create that problem definition. And for haptics, I think one of the most fundamental aspects is that what makes it challenging and what makes it an interesting problem for me to solve from a research perspective is that haptics has to be interactive. And that is an incredible challenge because you have to let a user interact with a system or environment in whatever way they want to, and you have to provide a haptic response, a sense of touch that's appropriate for that interaction. And you've probably seen people do all kinds of strange things with technology and computers or their cell phones, whatever it is that they're interacting with, and the haptic feedback has to respond appropriately. And so for me, that's kind of the problem definition of haptics. How do you let people do what they want to do with a system and yet give them a sense of touch which is appropriate for whatever that kind of interaction might be? The next phase is ideation and coming up with what is the way in which you might solve the problem or challenge that's brought to bear. And for me, looking at haptics is great for questioning assumptions. So many of you responded that sight is the most important sense, and so many of our interfaces with computers or mobile devices is through sight. And so if you want to sort of open your mind to the possibility of new designs, and in this case haptics, you have to question your assumptions about what is the most appropriate way to interact with a system. What is the best kind of feedback to give to a user? And that's a questioning of assumptions. It's a powerful tool for ideation. The next phase is prototyping. So you have to build, and don't expect that the first thing that you build is going to be the final product. And building, I mean that in the broadest sense of the word. Sometimes for me, as a mechanical engineer with an engineering background, prototyping often means physically building something, but it can also mean programming something. It can mean sort of creating a storyboard for how a process or a procedure might commence. And so prototyping in all of its forms is an essential part of the design process. And of course, for haptics, every time, say, one of my graduate students comes to me and says, I have a new haptic device or a new design or a new program that I've created, the first thing I say is, I need to feel it. And we try to interact with the systems that we make as quickly as possible. And I think one way to think about the field of haptics is it's a subfield of robotics. And one of the parts about haptics that I think it makes it a really fun area of robotics is that it is inherently interactive. You have to feel it in order to know that what you've designed is working correctly. So that prototyping phase is absolutely important. And then finally, there's testing. And actually, I shouldn't even say finally, because obviously this is an ongoing process. It loops back, and you would prototype over and over again. But going to testing, in my lab, we do both informal and formal user studies, and sometimes they're very, very quantitative in nature, where we will have, say, 2 types of haptic feedback we would like to test, and we will have one population of users, say, novice surgeons use one device, another group use a different device, and we see which one is better, and we try to really become quantitative, not only about users' performance, but their feedback, qualitative feedback as well about what they liked and what they found useful. And sometimes we also do user studies which follow a kind of, we call it an open response paradigm, where we might tell a user to draw what they feel or just tell us about what they perceive through a particular type of interface. And so these types of tests run the gamut. But it's always the case that after these tests, we learn a lot, we go back, we run through all of these steps, empathy, definition, ideation, prototyping, and testing over and over again throughout the design and research process. And so hopefully this gives you an idea of how our haptics research fits into sort of design thinking paradigm that really pervades a lot of the work that we do here at Stanford. So let me give a couple of examples. Before I go into the details of how we've applied haptics in medical robotics, I'd like to give some examples of haptics that you might be familiar with, since there are haptic devices in many commercial products now. So the first one is entertainment, which is really the big one in terms of at least commercial success so far. So many of you have probably played with the Nintendo Wii, and this is just one example. There are many other products that incorporate haptics. And if you've played with a Nintendo Wii and you take your sort of remote control that you hold in your hand and you play Wii tennis, as you swing your tennis racket to hit the ball, you'll feel a little vibration, a little burp kind of feeling right when you hit the ball. And that is a form of haptic feedback. You feel this vibration, you feel these changes in force, which let you know that you've hit the ball. Now, when you combine that with sound and vision, overall it provides an extremely compelling experience. I'll also note that sort of vibration feedback, that's sort of the poor man's haptic feedback. There's actually a lot more that we can do in addition to just feeling vibrations. We can use, with different types of devices, force feedback that actually generates the force and the shape of really pushing on and feeling three-dimensional objects. And this has been used in the next application example I want to mention, which is education. And broadly, this has been used at education at all levels. So in my labs at Stanford and formerly at Johns Hopkins, we've used simple, low-cost haptic devices, the designs of which we've made public, and feel free to contact me if you're interested in these. These low-cost haptic devices, students can use to hook them up and program them via computer, just like you would a small robot, but you can use them to generate different haptic sensations that might be able to communicate to a student what it means for something to be a spring or have a stiffness, for example. That's a little bit more for engineering education. On the other picture shows a surgical simulator from a company called Immersion, where I used to work part-time. And this company at the time made surgical simulators where you could actually feel like you were doing surgery. So in the picture, you have a person that's holding a type of endoscopic instrument, like a laparoscopic instrument that could be used for minimally invasive surgery. There's motors inside the box that apply forces to the tool that the user is holding, and he's seeing a graphical display of what it would look like to actually be performing surgery. And the important part here is that the motors are applying forces to the user, so he feels like he's actually manipulating real tissues. And just like flight simulators are now required for pilots to practice on before they fly commercial airplanes, more and more these types of surgical simulators are being used for surgeons and trainees to practice on before they perform on actual patients. And naturally, the realism and the utility of these devices are being very carefully studied and developed to be very sophisticated, so that when someone practices in these virtual environments, it really feels and looks and sometimes even sounds like doing real surgery. Last, more generally, there are just all sorts of human-computer interfaces that use haptics. So one example, if there are any lucky people out there that drive a BMW or maybe these days a Lexus that have a haptic interface, what's shown here on the left is a haptic knob, which as you turn the knob, it can be made to have different haptic sensations, different types of force feedback to the hand. So maybe the knob sometimes could feel very smooth, or another time it could be reprogrammed to feel like a series of clicks. And the idea is that this single knob, this single interface, could be used to control a wide variety of the different types of controls on the car, whether it's temperature, radio, etc. And this is now used in a wide variety of cars. Cell phones are another example. Right now, the type of haptic feedback that people get from phones is relatively rudimentary. It's this kind of poor man's vibration feedback. But you can make the vibration feel different depending on who's calling, just like you can change your ringtones. People have even programmed cell phones to have vibrations that correspond to their ringtone, so you can feel can't touch this through vibrations. And then a more, I guess, a commercial example, but is being used more on the development side, is that Boeing has developed haptic interfaces that allow them to navigate the very complex insides of an airplane during the design process to allow a user to kind of bounce around in the virtual environment that represents their airplane and see, can I actually, fit a part in a desired location or not? And sometimes having a human operator interact with this virtual environment to see if you can fit a part in or make a repair is actually much more efficient in terms of time and computation than just trying to do this sort of analysis by computation alone. So people are using haptic devices and human-computer interfaces for a wide variety of applications. So let's move on to robotics in medicine a little bit. And I'm going to spend much of the rest of the talk giving a particular example of how we've used haptics in medicine. But I thought first I should motivate a little bit about why are we even talking about robotics and haptics in medicine in the first place. If you are just familiar with robots from what you see in movies, you think of them as humanoids, potentially dangerous and scary. But there are a lot of good aspects of robotics that make them very applicable in medicine. And let me go through some of those points now. So first, robots can be more accurate and precise than people. That is, they can be more repeatable, they could do the same thing over and over, and they can do it in an untiring fashion as long as they're plugged into the wall or have enough batteries. Also, surgical robots, for example, can be smaller or larger than people as is needed for access. So what's pictured on the right here is a surgeon's hand and also a da Vinci surgical instrument. This comes from a company called Intuitive Surgical, which makes a commercial surgical robot, which I'll tell you a little bit more about earlier. But the idea is that this small instrument, which is only about 1 centimeter in length near the gripper as compared to 10 times that size for the human hand, can go into the body and has similar dexterity to that of the human hand. And it's controlled by a human operator, actually. So it's not an autonomous robot that is doing this based on its own intelligence, but it extends the reach and the accuracy and the dexterity of the surgeon in a way that is very minimally invasive to the patient. And just to look at the other side of the coin, this is an example of a robot that's smaller than the human operator. You can also have robots that are much larger than the human operator. So, for example, physical therapists often develop orthopedic problems, back problems from lifting heavy patients, trying to help them, say, relearn how to walk after a stroke. And so a large robot, which is, of course, designed to be safe and works in concert with a physical therapist, could be used to provide the weight support for a patient and then help the physical therapist do their job better. All of this sometimes necessitates that the robot be remotely operated. So just because of changes in scale, like I mentioned, a human operator can remotely control the robot. And sometimes this is also necessary just for reasons of safety. So some of the very first teleoperated robots were designed for cleaning up and manipulating nuclear materials. And, of course, you'd like to keep humans away from such dangerous sites. And so if you could use a remote robotic device, that could be very useful. I'll also point out in the next bullet that robots are connected to computers, which gives them access to information. And this is important because it's not just about the mechanical devices, although I'm a mechanical engineer by training, and I love the devices, but what really makes robots so powerful is that they have access to information, which in a clinical setting could be preoperative scans about the patient, and information from other types of sensors, and maybe talk about, say, blood oxygenation, and all of this information can be used to help control the robot. But I will point out that robots are not able to operate autonomously in all highly complex and certain environments yet. I think we're getting very close. Bill mentioned the great work of Professor Chris Gerdes doing autonomous cars, and obviously driving around in an urban environment is an extremely complex environment. But I would argue not yet as complex as the inside of a human body with its deformation and very immediate safety issues. In terms of the fact that there's physical interaction with a patient. And so there is an innate need for human interaction in robotic devices that are performing medical procedures, and this is where haptics comes in. I'll just note in one other slide about the potential impact of medical robotics and where I think using robots in clinical applications can really help us, and that's outlined here. So if you look along the diagonal line at the end of this triangle, you could say that a lot of treatments today are qualitatively and quantitatively limited by human abilities. So let's say you have an expert surgeon who's the only surgeon in the world that can do a particular procedure. Well, it has a very high level of challenge that a human might be able to meet, but very, very few patients could actually be treated. Conversely, sometimes there are some procedures which have less level of challenge and more patients could be treated. And the idea is that with various technologies, including robotics, you could have more clinicians perform even more difficult and even new procedures that we haven't even imagined yet, whether it's surgery or rehabilitation. So we want to expand both the number of patients, access to healthcare and treatment, as well as the level of challenge and the types of treatments that we can provide. And to give a picture of how this might work, I'm going to go through just a little flow chart of sort of a big vision for how robots can be used in medicine. So we really start out with two things. One is the patient, him or herself, as well as what we call an atlas, which is a record or information about lots of other patients and what was done to them who had similar deficits, similar difficulties. And all this information goes into what we call a preoperative planning stage, where you model the patient, often based on images, say for MRI or CT or X-ray, and you use computer programs to help you plan what is the best way to treat this patient. And again, the information coming into this block is not just about the patient, him or herself, but also lots of information about what happened to other patients, and that's very important. So after this planning stage, you actually go into an intraoperative stage. And while I'm using kind of surgery here as an example, there's also applications here for rehabilitation and other medical applications. So in this intraoperative stage, you may update the model, you may update the plan, and the robotics comes in here in terms of having a physical real-time computer assistance. And these robots can take many, many forms. In this one, we have our surgeon in green who's sort of cooperatively manipulating a robotic device as the patient's being imaged in order to perform some kind of procedure. And that sort of C-shaped thing is a C-arm X-ray, which we should have more and more of these imagers inside the operating room used in real time. And then finally, there's a post-operative stage that afterwards you assess what was actually done to the patient. Was the procedure successful? And all this information can go into the database that can inform that atlas. So the next time you have a patient with a similar problem, or if you have to retreat this same patient for some reason, that you really have a good record and understanding of what was done. And the great thing about having a robotic device and all these sensors in this loop is that you have a real quantitative information about what actually occurred. Now, I'll note that while this sort of procedure isn't currently always being applied in medicine, that it's not a completely new idea. So for people that have manufacturing experience, you might actually recognize these blocks. The first block being like computer-aided design, the second like computer-assisted manufacturing, and the last being total quality management. And so if you're familiar with these concepts in manufacturing, it's really applying these same ideas to trying to make medicine better. Of course, I'm not implying that patients are products or anything like that, but the idea being that you want their outcome to be the very best possible, and you should bring to bear all the tools that you can is highly motivating for medical researchers and technology developers. So given that somewhat long-winded introduction to medical robotics and why I think it's useful and important and why we should consider it, I want to talk now more specifically about haptic feedback and robot-assisted surgery and just give you one example of a research project that we've done that incorporates haptics that might help, put an exact implementation in your head when you think about how we use design thinking in our research. So we have interacted very closely with a company called Intuitive Surgical, which makes a commercially available surgical robot called the Vinci surgical system. And this is a teleoperated robot where the surgeon, you see in the green scrub, sits at a surgeon console and basically manipulates what amounts to a fancy 7-degree of joystick. It moves in 7 directions, basically. You can think of it as X, Y, Z, yaw, pitch, roll, and then gripper. And then the patient-side robot, which does look a little big and scary, is actually going into the patient through very, very small, thin instruments. The overall robot behind these instruments is quite large, but what's actually going into the patient are very small tools. And so this teleoperated robot is allowing the surgeon to have the kind of dexterity inside the patient with minimal access and minimal invasiveness, which I mentioned earlier as one of the great advantages of using robotics in surgery. And despite the fact that it's teleoperation, the surgeon is still in the same room as the patient. We still need all of the same medical personnel there in order to provide the anesthesia, to check on all the patient's vitals, et cetera. But the idea is that the robot can make the surgery less invasive for the patient and much more accurate. So I think I'm going to actually skip over a couple of these slides just to get to the specifics of our research topics so that we can make sure we have time for questions. And you'll be able to look at all the slides later if you like. So let's look at, for a system like the Da Vinci surgical robot, the commercial robot, while wildly successful and it's being used in hundreds of thousands of surgical procedures every year, it currently does not have haptic feedback to the user. That is, when the surgeon is teleoperating the remote robot, he does not feel what is happening at the patient's side. The surgeon could see what's happening at the remote side. So in the picture shown here, you can see an instrument that's poking at an artificial tissue, but the surgeon wouldn't normally feel this information. And so we did a study where we modified a surgical robot and we looked at what would happen if you provided haptic feedback to the user. And we also wanted to understand, does it really have to be haptics? That is, does it really have to be forces applied to the surgeon's hands, or could it be some other modality, like an extra visual display? And so what you also see in the image in the lower left is a little bar graph, which currently is kind of halfway up and it's colored green. And as the surgeon pushed down on that environment, the bar can go up or down depending on how much force is applied. So with these different types of feedback modalities, we actually have 4 conditions that we can test. The first one in red, which is labeled HG, is haptic plus graphical. So haptics means we program the system so the user gets force feedback to their hands, letting them know what is the force being applied to the environment, and the graphical part is this visual display. H is haptic only. G is just that graphical only, just that visual bar graph which has been overlaid on the image that the surgeon sees. And NF means no force feedback. So the surgeon would still get the normal video, but wouldn't feel forces through their hands and wouldn't see this extra bar graph. And it turns out that if you take an experienced robotic surgeon, this is someone who's done many, many surgeries already in patients with the robot, we find that in detecting a hard lump inside tissue, the error is greatly decreased when you have haptic feedback. So this is the kind of quantitative testing that we would like to do in order to ensure that the things that we design are going to be appropriate to be brought into the clinic. And so you can see the HG and the H, which are the 2 conditions where the user felt real force feedback to the hands, have much less error than the graphical or no force feedback. And those thin lines, those vertical bars, which are the thin lines, are errors because of the variability of the different users. And you can also see the variability is much larger when the users don't have force feedback. And so this really motivates the idea that, well, so maybe graphical information can't really replace haptic information in a task like this. It really does need to be force feedback. Okay. So overall, using this kind of technology, our goal is to improve surgery. And just to bring this back to the design thinking approach, I'll note that for a project like this, we need to empathize with surgeons and in some cases with patients. I have to say in the surgery example, the patient is usually under anesthesia and they're not really using the system. But in other applications we work on, like prosthetics or rehabilitation, the patients are involved. We need to define the problem. Can we really make a surgeon better with haptic feedback, and what different conditions do we want to test? In this case, our idea was that we should test both visual displays as well as haptic displays. Part of the reason being that a graphical display would actually be cheaper to implement in a surgical robot than applying force feedback. But by prototyping the system and doing a test, we could actually determine which is the best feedback modality for a situation like this. So, and this was one example of a single research study, but this one that I just showed was done several years ago, and it is a research topic that we just revisit over and over again, and we look at how do you give haptic feedback in different ways, and so it's not like we go once through this process and say that we're done. We definitely revisit and look at every year we're coming up with new projects on how do you incorporate haptics into environments like this. So with that, I want to thank you for listening to my talk.
Let's take a couple of questions here. I think you can look at the slide on the Master Series and the next dates. I'd be happy to send you some information on that. But we got a couple of questions I want to get to. One question came in from one of the participants talking about medical robotics and the things that are in clinical testing and things that are already out in deployment. And the question was, there have been very few cases of cardiac surgery done with using medical robotics. And the question is this because the devices are really expensive and difficult to learn, or is this skepticism by cardiac surgeons? In general, could you comment, Allison, on how these kinds of really radical new surgical techniques using robot assistance are being adopted or thought about by the medical establishment?
That's a really great question, because actually the company Intuitive Surgical that designed this da Vinci surgical robot, their actual original goal was cardiac surgery, to do the very complex procedures, including a lot of suturing, et cetera, during heart surgery. And you're right that it hasn't actually been adopted that much in cardiac. The place where the robot has been really successful has actually been in prostate surgery, to remove sections of the prostate due to cancer. And so people from the company actually sort of joke that they aimed at the heart and hit the groin. But that's actually the way that the robot was developed, was originally for cardiac procedures. And I don't believe that any lack of success of the robot has anything to do with surgeons sort of just wanting to turn a blind eye towards this new technology. Pretty much every surgeon I've talked to, some have healthy skepticism, but nevertheless are really interested in any technology that will help improve patient care. So it's actually every experience I've had with surgeons of all types, and interventional radiologists as well, has been extremely positive in terms of just wanting to make sure that we're doing the right thing for patients. But as to why I think that it hasn't been as successful in cardiac surgery, I think is because of the increased complexity of cardiac procedures. If you say want to do a triple bypass, the amount of time that takes and the number of operating room personnel that are required is it's just extremely heavy load. And because of the complexity of the procedure, it has made it much harder to incorporate robotics in the operating room. And I do think that the lack of haptic feedback is part of that. I'd say it's still an ongoing hypothesis that has to be tested and fully worked out. But because of the delicacy of the movements and manipulations that are being done in cardiac surgery, having haptic feedback really should improve procedures of that nature. It's not to say that prostate surgery is an easy thing, but there's a little less kind of criticalness to the delicacy of the manipulation that occurs in that case.
Great. We have time for maybe one more question. This is not in the medical field, but just in the general area of input devices. we've sort of been stuck with keyboards and mice for as long as, anyone can remember. Here's a question. Are there any portable devices or other input devices that use haptic interfaces that can substitute for keyboards, touch screens, or other, kind of the common interaction interfaces that we have for our computing devices? What's on the horizon?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, even with haptic devices, there has to be sort of sensing of the human input, and then the haptics is the feedback that then returns to the user. And input devices these days are so limiting. Even on some of the nice touchscreen interfaces, maybe you move from one finger to two finger and multi-touch, but that's still pretty limiting. And so, these days, for example, Microsoft came out a couple years ago with the Kinect, which tracks whole body motion, and more devices like that are being designed actually just for the hands. And so gesture inputs are definitely being used more and more, but they also create a lot of challenges in terms of how you actually then give haptic feedback to the user, because you may be now moving your hands in space and not directly touching something. And so that's actually leading researchers to develop more wearable haptic devices, things that you might have sewn into your clothes, and sensors even sewn into your clothes, things that are just wearable and become part of your environment without explicitly saying, okay, we're going to make this into an interface.